Welcome to our discussion on affordable housing. We have a special guest today, Dr. Ben Carson, the Secretary of HUD. Thank you for joining us.
Very nice to be here.
Dr. Carson, racial inequalities in the home buying process, how big of a problem is it, and what is HUD doing about it?
Well, you know, there are certain regions of the country where there are enormous restrictions. Zoning restrictions, all kinds of regulatory problems. Those are the places where the prices are the highest. You look at a place like Los Angeles, 70 to 80% of the land is zoned for single-family housing. And you throw on top of that all the regulatory things, including most recently solar panels. You know, it becomes incredibly expensive. We've got 37 million American households who, have some cost burden. They have to spend more than 30% of their income on housing, and 18 million households that are severely cost burdened, spending more than 50%. We're not producing housing nearly as fast as we're producing families. So for every 10 families that are being produced, we're able to produce about 7 housing units. So it's a growing problem. Now, I guess.
And what can be done about it? Because, as you mentioned, the demand is very high.
Well, there are two schools of thought. One school of thought says, we just need to throw more money at it. And the other, more logical school of thought, and I'm sure you can figure out which one I'm with, says, let's look at the source of the problem and let's attack that. So that means working at the federal, state, and local level with the municipalities to look at some of these zoning restrictions and some of these other regulatory barriers, density and height and parking and all these kinds of things, and relax some of the things. Like Mayor Garcetti recently said, you could put accessory dwelling units in the yard. Well, that provides for another family. So those kind of things make a huge difference. And then also new building techniques. Recently there was a demonstration on the National Mall of new housing techniques, 3D printed housing, manufactured housing. Manufactured housing can be produced at half to 2/3 the cost of site-built housing, tends to weather storms better, appreciates in value just equally with a site-built home. These are great solutions, and new products are coming out all the time. So we're trying to upgrade what we're doing with the technology as it advances as well to help take care of some of the affordability needs.
The economy is doing well, and certainly we've seen with the unemployment rate with African Americans and Hispanics is way down, as well as the national average. How has that impacted your work in getting more affordable housing? Because more people are making money, there are more people who are employed.
Yeah, well, the average wages have gone up 3.1, 3.2%. Average rent and housing prices have gone up 3.8 to 3.9%. So it's sort of like chasing your tail.
Yeah, right.
Which is why, again, we have to attack that problem at its source.
You mentioned new technology, and you have in June, HUD is involved in innovating housing showcase. What is that, and who's involved in that?
Well, this was an ideal that sprung up at HUD, and we're saying, how do we make sure that people know about all the new things that have happened? Because we've been doing things pretty much the same way for the last 50 years, and people just don't know. And this includes Congress as well. So that was the whole ideal behind it, and doing it on the National Mall so that congressional people and staffers would get an opportunity to actually know that you can put up a solid, permanent structure in a very short period of time that is extremely durable and that is cost effective.
Some have criticized HUD for proposing to eliminate a federal fund now used to repair public housing. What is the role? I've seen you quoted as saying you want to have the private industry more involved.
Yeah, public-private partnerships are really the answer there. For years and years, we just kept throwing more and more money after these capital expenditures and not making any progress. Where we have made progress is through something like the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. It's a public-private partnership. And in this situation, the private sector now takes partial responsibility for the building and partial ownership, but it remains in PBRA so that the units remain affordable, and that's really the key, and this extends over decades. And yet you have a private sector partner who's interested in the maintenance of that structure. The difference was in the past, the government would come and they would build these structures, and then they would leave. And it would immediately begin to deteriorate. There was one public housing complex in St. Louis that only lasted 20 years before it had to be demolished because there was no one taking care of it. So that's one of the big solutions. One of the other big things is the opportunity zones.
Right, in the tax law.
Yeah, that was part of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and it allows people to take unrealized capital gains, invest them into these 8,761 opportunity zones around the country. And
does that help minorities specifically?
It does, because if you build up the infrastructure in their area and you build up the businesses in their area and you build more affordable housing in their area, and at the same time fix Section 3, which we are in the process of doing right now, which says if you're getting HUD funding, you have an obligation to hire, train, or give contracts to the low-income people in that area. Even though it's been on the books for 50 years, people haven't used it because it's been too complex and encumbered by bureaucracy. We're fixing it so that that's not the case and incentivizing people to use it, which means that people will now be able to gain skills which will allow them to be independent. And they won't be reluctant to do it because we're also in the process of trying to remove the the barriers that kept people from wanting to climb the ladder. These perverse incentives, like if you make more money, you have to report that so your rent can go up. If you bring another income-producing person into your household, you have to report that so your rent can go up. Don't even think about getting married. Just crazy stuff. So removing that, and then providing the opportunities for people to gain the skills and climb those ladders, and providing the kinds of housing that's supportive in the process.
Deregulation has been very important to this administration. You focused on it. How has deregulation at HUD helped minorities get more affordable housing?
Well, anytime that you can remove the barriers that cause the housing to become so expensive, that's where you make the progress. For instance, you go back to something like the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act. The way it had been structured is that the different localities would have to fill out these very complex forms that a large number of them could not complete appropriately. But all it would do is really produce a big screen with pink and red and yellow and blue dots. And so if you move some of the red ones where the pink ones are and the blue ones over here, somehow that's going to take care of segregation. The reason that people are segregated in housing is not because, there's a George Wallace standing at the door. It's because they can't afford to move to other areas. So what I've decided that we should do instead is focus on how do we break that problem up. And the way that we obviously do that is make it possible to build more affordable housing and to make it possible for people who have vouchers to be able to move to other areas. So, we started a national task force to work with landlords to find out why they weren't accepting vouchers and then rectifying the situation. That's, again, and maybe it comes from my medical background, but I'd like to go to the source of the problem rather than treating the symptoms.
As far as regulations or legislation, what are you doing as far as just the basic making housing more affordable? How can Congress help you? There's been a lot of gridlock on Capitol Hill, but what can be done in the next 2 to 4 to 10 years?
Well, unfortunately, most of the things that are driving the cost are not national things. They're not federal things. They're the 80+% of the cost is done at the state and local level. So that's why we're working with the states. That's why we're giving preference points for grants to those who are actually tackling these things, incentivizing them. That's the way we do it.
Is it easier working with the states than Congress?
Almost anything is easier than working with Congress.
Well, very nice. Well, thank you, Dr. Carson, for joining us. I appreciate it.
A pleasure.
Okay, and then thank you. That was great. Okay. Well, I think the first one was answered, but let me ask the second one. You want to just one more question on the housing? One question on gentrification. How can that be addressed, and what are you doing on that issue? It's a hot button issue.
Well, first of all, for those who don't know what that is, that's, people feel that they don't want, particularly white people, quite frankly, moving into their neighborhoods and taking away, the housing opportunities for them. That's, the bottom line. I actually think you don't particularly need to worry about that if you do it the right way. You create mixed income housing, and in the places where that's been done already, it has worked beautifully. And you have.
But where specifically? Or like different cities around the country?
Take Eastlake, outside of Atlanta,
Okay.
a purpose-built community. Worst crime area in the whole area. Schools performing at a horrendous level. Poverty at the lowest rate. And they rebuilt that whole community, mixed income neighborhood, grocery stores, 2 charter schools. I went into one of the high schools there. Unbelievable. I was met by 5 students playing the harp, and I looked at all the things that they exposed the students to. They're achieving at a level higher than most of the private schools. This is what can be done, but it has to be planned. It has to be coordinated, and that's what we've lacked in the past.